Welcome to lecture number 79. Topic 7.11, Interwar Foreign Policy. The theme is America in the World. The learning objective says, explain the similarities and differences in attitudes about the nation's proper role in the world. This key concept picks up on the tail end of World War I. In the years following World War I, the United States pursued a unilateral foreign policy that used international investments, peace treaties, and select military intervention to promote a vision of international order, even while maintaining U.S. isolationism. To start, unilateral means that decisions are made by one entity without need for approval from other parties. This would not be the case if the U.S. had joined the League of Nations. The first two tools that the U.S. used was international investment and peace treaties. The U.S. developed a Dawes Plan to ensure that reparation payments from Germany continued to go to France and Britain, because France and Britain relied on them to repay loans they borrowed from the United States during the war. It created a circle of money that started with the U.S. and ended with the U.S. The reparations that had been set for Germany at the Treaty of Versailles were too much for any country to be able to repay while rebuilding from the war. It was made worse when heavy machinery and other industrial equipment was taken from Germany in lieu of reparations. That limited Germany's ability to repay reparations because they don't have the means or capacity to produce goods. As the Depression neared, there were talks of restructuring or pausing the reparations amounts and payments, but because France didn't want there to be a pause, then the whole system falls apart the moment that one country stopped making its payments. Therefore, the Dawes Plan was successful until it wasn't. The U.S. also set up reciprocal trade agreements under FDR, removing tariffs and trading relationships. This may bring on more competition to domestic producers, but it may increase economic activity altogether. The peace treaties that the U.S. enters into are outside of the work that the League of Nations was doing. In 1921 through 1922, the Washington Conference invited 9 countries to enter into mutual agreements on limiting militarization and respecting China's sovereignty. The Five Powers Treaty, which included France, Italy, Great Britain, and Japan, and the U.S., comes out of this conference, and it sets limits on the amount of naval power that countries can build. A ratio is set with the United States buildup as the baseline, so if the United States built more naval power, then other countries could also build up their naval powers in proportion to the U.S. buildup. Countries like Japan were going to be able to do this at a reduced ratio, however. The U.S. also entered into the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact. This essentially said that any international conflict that came about would not be resolved using violence or war. That sounds really great and idealistic, but in reality, the Kellogg-Briand Pact did allow for defensive wars, and it had no repercussions built in for anyone that attacked someone else with their military. There was no way of enforcing it, and for that reason, when Germany starts taking over new territory in the 1930s, nothing could be done. The U.S. had limited military interventions during this period, and actually stood back as other countries expanded their territory through aggressive means. For example, Japan was in the midst of expanding its Pacific Empire. They attacked the Korean Peninsula earlier in 1910. In 1931, they attacked northern China, which is the territory that's called Manchuria. They take it and rename it Manchukuo, and there's absolutely no action by the international community, regardless of all the war crimes that were alleged in the region. Japan had promised that we weren't going to invade new territories in previous conferences. Europe and the United States didn't have a response other than the Stimson Doctrine. It said that the U.S. would not recognize Manchukuo as part of Japan, and that it was still technically going to be considered Chinese territory. So it's not much of a repercussion because Japanese forces were still there, and that won't change until the end of World War II. There was an instance of U.S. military intervention in 1927 in Nicaragua. The U.S. was called in by the pro-American conservative government to tip the scales in the civil war that had arisen. Augusto Cesar Sandino led a resistance effort against an American occupation of Nicaragua and drew U.S. troops into a guerrilla war. Sandino was eventually assassinated by a military dictator in 1934, but resistance efforts against military dictatorship and foreign intervention took on his name as Sandinistas. As World War II started to look more likely with Hitler's expansion of Germany in the 1930s, the U.S. signed the Neutrality Acts in 1935, 1936, and then one more time in 1937, each time making greater efforts to ensure that the United States was not dragged into another global conflict. FDR gave a speech that is referred to as the Quarantine Speech. He wanted to isolate all aggressors, and that all other democracies in the world needed to exclude and ostracize them for being aggressive towards other countries. At the same time, he's also leading a preparedness movement, because very much like Woodrow Wilson in the lead up to World War I, it seemed almost inevitable that the U.S. was going to have to step in and help their former allies. The Selective Service Training and Service Act was passed in 1940, which instituted a peacetime draft to try and get ready for a possible conflict. The last key concept covers the U.S. entry into the war. In the 1930s, while many Americans were concerned about the rise of fascism and totalitarianism, most opposed taking military action against the aggression of Nazi Germany and Japan until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into World War II. There was a rise of fascism and totalitarianism all across the world. It really wasn't just across Europe. There was Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, Franco in Spain, and Hideki Tojo in Japan. The Spanish Civil War had been going on earlier in the 1930s, and Franco's fascist forces ended up winning. General Hideki Tojo took control from Emperor Hirohito, making him a figurehead, and led Japan towards an imperialist crusade across all the Pacific. In response, there was a shift in U.S. policy. FDR viewed the world through a lens in which democracy was fighting fascism. FDR's Four Freedom speech calls for a defense on the freedom of speech, worship, freedom of want, and freedom of fear. FDR will do what he can to help the Allied powers to fight against the Axis powers and fascist powers in whatever way he can without breaking the Neutrality Act. One of the programs is called Cash and Carry. If Allied powers were to purchase military goods from the United States and paid in cash, then transported those goods themselves across the Atlantic, then that was allowed under the Neutrality Act. The Destroyers for Bases programs and the Lend-Lease Act were similar acts that provided military equipment to allies by skirting the letter of the law of the Neutrality Acts. The Atlantic Charter was a joint declaration between FDR and Winston Churchill which outlined what a possible post-war world would look like. It's very similar to Wilson's 14 points, but it was issued before the U.S. had entered the war in August 1941. The opponents of the war also saw the path that the U.S. was taking and ramped up their opposition. The America First Committee and one of its main proponents was Charles Lindbergh, were the main isolationist voice. Lindbergh was an international celebrity for being the first to complete a solo transatlantic flight. Lindbergh has been called a Nazi sympathizer for his work with the America First Committee, but it's not quite that simple. His views on isolationism were primarily motivated to avoid war, though some of his writings do express anti-Semitic views. Anti-Semitism wasn't rare in the U.S., especially considering the nativism against Eastern European migrants from earlier in the period. There were also Nazi sympathizers in the U.S. who held rallies in major cities. A documentary film called The Night at the Garden documents one of these Nazi rallies that had an American twist to it at Madison Square Garden in New York City. While the American people were split on whether or not to join the war, there was a lot more consensus after December 7, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The news spreads rapidly through the use of radio broadcasts. Even though a lot of people in the U.S. didn't know where Pearl Harbor was because Hawaii was not yet a state, FDR informed the nation about the attack. About 2,000 Americans died in all, service members and civilians. FDR described it as a day that will live in infamy. To those who lived through it, it was as traumatic as the September 11th terrorist attacks. And finally, for the recap, the United States tried to maintain peaceful relations without joining the League of Nations. There were unilateral treaties that were unsuccessful in maintaining peace abroad, and as fascist leaders became more aggressive, U.S. policy shifted to support democracies and all the allies. Finally, on December 7, 1941, the United States enters into a war over the Pearl Harbor attack. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.